So, a friend got me Elden Ring for my birthday, and after 85 hours, I finally beat the game. I had an absolute blast playing it. I defeated all the Remembrance bosses except the Lich Dragon Fortisax, and I went through the whole game only using summons on the Wolf Dude in the castle to the south, Margit, and the Godskin duo. Everyone else I beat with no summons, and I was pretty proud of myself. I know I'm a bit behind the curve on beating this game, but I now understand why this game was so heavily praised. This game has me thinking a lot though, because this is the first actual FromSoft Souls game I've played since the first ones, and the first one I just did not like. That being said, Elden Ring feels a lot different than I thought it would be. If you remember in my Armored Core video, I mentioned how action RPGs line up on kind of like a spectrum to how action focused they are versus how RPG focused they are. Back when I made the video, I had never played Elden Ring or any FromSoft Souls games, and the closest thing I had played was Nioh. Back when I originally made that video, I might have placed Elden Ring more so on the action side, but after playing it, it definitely belongs more on the RPG side, particularly for a first playthrough. Again, looking back at my Armored Core video, there are a few statements that resonate with me looking now at Elden Ring that fit exactly my experience with the game. Elden Ring's action component is that you have bosses with very precise mechanics and abilities that you have to learn the timings to dodge and punish. There's also a huge variety of different builds you can do, and Elden Ring lets you express how you want to tackle the action element of the game in a dizzying array of possibilities. There are so many fun and unique ways to play through Elden Ring, but you need to level up and explore the world first in order to access the gear and abilities needed to really complete a build. To give you perspective on how important the leveling for an initial playthrough of Elden Ring is, most builds that you'll find on YouTube have their characters set to around level 150. This is because when you put more stats into the required attributes with 150 points to spend, in your most important stats, you reach the point where putting more points into an important stat starts to get pretty hard with diminishing returns. In my 85-hour first playthrough of Elden Ring, with even spending the 500,000 runes you get for beating the final boss, I was at level 141. I promise this is not a testament to my skill, but it goes to show how much of an emphasis there is on exploring and leveling up and finding gear on your first playthrough. This game gets the moniker of being a super scary action game because of the difficulty of the bosses. That being said though, Elden Ring can be as easy or as difficult as you want it. If you realize you're doing no damage to something and you don't want to bang your head against the wall, you don't have to. In my Armored Core 6 video, I said, with an RPG you have the tiny little failsafe of the player knowing that they could go back, do another quest or two, and have that increase their odds to beat a boss. And that is almost an immediate core philosophy in the game of Elden Ring. One of the first enemies you encounter, even though somehow I personally didn't, is the Tree Sentinel, who with no gear or levels is actually really tough. After getting thrashed a lot, you realize that you have this beautiful world to explore, so you go out, check some other area, scoop up a level or two and maybe a new piece of gear, then you come back to the boss you were struggling with, in this case, the Tree Sentinel, and you finish the challenge you were left with. If you want a more action game oriented experience though, at any time you get to a boss, you can force yourself to battle the boss over and over until you win through skill alone and not going around getting bigger numbers. I suffered far more against the first boss and the Chapter 4 boss of Armored Core 6 than I did with most of the bosses in Elden Ring, particularly any of the required ones. The early game dungeons though actually gave me a ton of trouble. The dungeons are just absolute gauntlet at the early game, trying to get from Grace Point to Grace Point. Maybe particularly because I was a caster and needed to more judiciously split my potions between health and mana, but just making it through the swarms of enemies with making as little mistakes as possible was brutal. And then there's the dumb zombies in the academy. If I ever got accidentally grabbed, it would cost me 2 potions instead of 1 because they eat your mana as well. So as a caster in the early game, I was just absolutely destroyed by the academy, to the point where I went out, had to find more gear, acquired more potions, and came back and beat the dungeon. And then there are some bosses later in the game where I had so much fighting them, I just sat there stubbornly fighting them over and over until I beat them. This game has so many tools and options for you to experience the game the way you want to. If the difficulty level that is comfortable for you, even without a specific difficulty slider. One thing I don't see mentioned as much about Elden Ring is that it's a very distilled horror game as well. I don't play too many horror games. I've played a Resident Evil here or there, I've played Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and I've watched most of the Evil Within being played, but I didn't come into Elden Ring wanting or expecting a horror game. And it wasn't even a horror game the entire way through, but there were enough horror-esque moments where I was just terrified or unsettled that it kind of hit me by surprise. First off, the tension in Elden Ring of getting runes and the potential of losing the runes on death is so high, with all the enemies doing so much damage. It's absolutely horrifying. Walking around any corner and being worried about what unnatural horror is going to leap out from behind it and eat you. I also think the fact that you're not always fighting horrifying, grotesque creatures, that you're just sometimes fighting some normal humans, that it makes moments where when you have a boatload of runes to spend and you're assaulted by some ungodly creature with big eyes or too many limbs and you can't immediately understand what they're capable of by just looking at them, it makes your adrenaline spike because you don't want to die and you are just so uncertain with how to deal with the creature in front of you, when the creature can just most likely kill you in 2 or 3 hits tops. The tension this game creates in that aspect is just amazing and perfect. And while it is annoying to have to go collect runes on death, I'm so torn on whether I would get rid of it or not, simply because the tension it creates is incredible. I wonder if you could do that sort of thing in like a Resident Evil or a different horror game with a genre. A lot of horror series that I see in the horror genre go for the horror aspect and just weird baddies with limited ammo. I get the horror aspect as you get more limited resources. The feeling of impending doom creeps closer and closer. But in those games, it doesn't feel like you have much reason to fear dying, in my opinion. I just remember that the first time I played Amnesia and I went through most of the game without dying at first, and then after the first time I died from a monster and got placed back at a checkpoint, so much of the tension was just lost, and I eventually just lost most interest in the game. What if you inversed a Resident Evil game where the game just throws ammo at you? You're just swimming in ammo. But it also throws even more enemies at you, and so even if you're killing them all, you're still being overrun if you're not clever, and maybe you lose your stores of ammo on death and you have to go recollect your ammo or something when you get it back. I don't know, maybe ammo isn't the right resource, but I hope you see what I'm getting at. Just giving more of a reason to the player not wanting to die. Again, I'm not claiming to be a master of the horror genre, but I'm just saying maybe it's a concept that could be explored by someone that's not me, and that the experience of a horror game is not what I expected when I first came into Elden Ring. Next, I wanted to just talk about how it handles its open world aspect. I've not really been a fan of open world games in the past. The first open world game I really enjoyed was Cyberpunk 2077. The one thing I really appreciate about Cyberpunk was that when it throws you out into its open world, for a pretty large radius around where you could start exploring, things were reasonably approachable level or difficulty, so you were actually genuinely free to explore wherever you wanted, and it felt much better growing into the world. I think Elden Ring handles this in kind of a funny way, where being a Souls-like game, the majority of the stuff is going to one-shot you anyways, so it's kind of difficult to tell where you are or not supposed to be. And in that sense, the whole world feels as inviting as a world filled with things ready to one-shot you can feel. I guess now that I think about it, the only open world games that I've tried and really haven't liked have been Bethesda games, so maybe I just don't like the Bethesda open world formula. That's a topic for another day. Besides Elden Ring genuinely inviting you to go wherever you please at the beginning of the game, so many small and not so small decisions go into the emphasis of the beautiful world they have crafted for this game. It feels like maybe every hour you put into the game, you come across some gorgeous new vista that is so stunning, and after just admiring the scenery for 10 seconds, you're just like, oh, I can go explore everything I see. The game has a very minimalist UI that disappears rather quickly when you're out of combat, to the point where a few times I wanted to check how much health I had or how many runes I had without opening up the menus entirely to slow the gameplay down. And it took me a while to figure out that you can bring up the UI by just pressing the Y button, so that was kind of an interesting experience. They go so far to preserve the immersion that they have actually 0 forms of quest tracking. This is by far my biggest gripe of the game, and I can see how having a quest tracker on the screen telling you what to do or where to go takes a little bit away from emphasizing to the player that they should go and explore the world as they see fit. Because if you take a look at like WoW or something, with the quest tracking, it can get pretty obnoxious. But they could have at least had a tab in their main menu for quest objectives. I shouldn't need to go on YouTube to just remind me what the last thing I did for a quest was. And while it was annoying, I will admit, leaning into the emphasis of their open world was still a good call because it is by far the best aspect of the game. Now, probably the most infamous part of this game is its boss fights. My personal favorite fights were Moog and Placidusax, and my least favorite being the Godskin duo and like a few assortments of the mid-game dragon fights being just annoying. Many people the internet over have dissected the Elden Ring boss fights, and there seems to be two main opinions on the Elden Ring fights. The first camp being that the boss fights encourage defensive play too much and don't allow for the player to have enough of an opening. And then there's the other camp that think Elden Ring bosses are simply a fundamental shift in FromSoft boss design, where instead of a boss having this "okay, please attack me now" moment, you have to find your own moments to strike. I think that depending on the boss, both camps are right in a way. I think Moog is a really good example of a relentless boss that while he does actually have some pretty traditional openings as well, you can also get really creative with finding your own windows to land strikes. Of course, one of my favorite bosses in the game, and I forget to turn on my recording, so I don't actually have footage of my attempts on him, but his strikes take so long trying to punish rolls that you can actually weave your own attacks in between his very consistently, and it feels great. I think Godfrey, on the other hand, while he's not a bad fight, starts to get a little on the too aggressive end, where when I fought him, I kind of just resorted to running out of his range and spamming Transient Moonlight. I have seen, though, other people fight Godfrey, and they are much better at the game than I am and can get much more creative with their punishes by jumping over attacks and just running around him in circles to be able to punish more things consistently. And so I understand that you can definitely get more creative than I was, but he still just feels a little on the aggressive side. Both him and Morgott, to me, feel like they're playing Devil May Cry, and I'm over here stuck trying to play a Souls-like. And it just kind of, these bosses were kind of personally like, why do I feel like the boss is having way more fun than I am? But as I say this feeling of fighting beings and creatures with way more options than I have, it definitely feels intentional, even if I'm a little jealous. This feeling of just being a dude tasked with insurmountable odds reminds me so deeply of another game, and I don't think I've actually seen the similarity drawn before. The way this game focuses so wholly on immersion, and the way the game tells its story in a way that tries to be unobtrusive as possible, but it's definitely still there. And finally, the way you're just a dude with a sword or a staff or faith in some deity, fighting as gods, demigods, and unspeakable horrors. This entire time I played Elden Ring, it feels like the spiritual successor to the Shadow of the Colossus. I can't help but feel that if Shadow of the Colossus were to have a modern successor, it would feel something like Elden Ring. Every feeling I felt playing Shadow of the Colossus, I felt somewhere in Elden Ring and vice versa. Shadow of the Colossus has you traveling these vast, beautiful landscapes, wondering what kind of insane creature you have to fight next. I think Shadow of the Colossus literally only has a health bar and a stamina bar for UI, and only the glow of the sword tells you where you need to go next, which is similar to the tree roots being the only indicator of what you should be doing in Elden Ring. Even the final bosses of both games are really annoying. I'm curious if there's an interview somewhere saying if this was intentional or not, but evoking the same feeling as Shadow of the Colossus on a much grander scale is a feat all on its own. Lastly, Elden Ring is just an absolutely massive game. I didn't play this game when it first came out, obviously, but I had been on the fence about buying the game for a long time, and before owning the game, I watched videos going through all the boss fights to see if there were fun-looking bosses in particular I wanted to fight. So I had seen what felt like a lot of the game going in. Once I started playing, though, I stopped watching videos until I got to the point where I felt like I had seen most of the game. And once I hit that point, I started to watch videos to help round out what kind of build I wanted to keep focusing on. But every time I tried that, I kept seeing new places and zones I'd never been to, so I'd stop watching the video, and then I'd come back thinking, okay, I saw that one place, so now I can safely watch this video. And then I'd see another zone I hadn't been to, and then I'd stop again, and this cycle would just go on and on. Until even now, after beating the game, there's multiple major quest lines that unlock different endings that I haven't done. There's at least one infamously annoying boss that I haven't done, the gargoyles, and one final remembrance boss that I haven't even done yet, which is the Lich Dragon. And just as someone who's slowly becoming a game developer myself, this game just seems impossibly large. It has me excited and curious at how much content the upcoming DLC is going to have, and I'm looking forward to going to the Land of Shadow. Well, thanks for sticking around and watching another video by yours truly. Hope you enjoyed, and remember to stay toasty.